And so moving along in our Kant discussion here of the critique of judgment, we move into the section that Kant calls the deduction. This is the deduction of the pure aesthetical judgments, corresponds to the deduction in the critique of pure reason, which is to say the justification of the concepts themselves, in this case the justification of the aesthetical judgments. And Kant is actually going to maintain that the judgments of taste are actually also, like the judgments of science, are also synthetic a priori judgments. They are synthetic because the judgment of taste synthesizes a representation, an intuition, a perception, with my feeling of pleasure or displeasure. That's synthesized together with it, so it's empirical in that respect. But yet, it's also a priori in the sense in which, as we've seen in the previous chapters on the modalities of the sublime and of the beautiful, it also rests on necessity in the sense that it's necessarily beautiful, in the sense that if I have taste and I find this thing beautiful, then I can assert that everyone else who has taste will also find this thing beautiful. And I know that they'll find it beautiful prior to them even seeing it, if they have taste. So it's a priori. So it's a kind of synthetic a priori type of judgment because it also pretends to an absolute necessity. And then he says what this deduction is about then how synthetic a priori judgments of taste are possible. And I don't think that he answers it satisfactorily. What that really is a way, for me, this section is a collection of odds and ends, and I think it's a way of just giving a certain synthetic unity to the section itself. I don't think he ever answers that question satisfactorily, at least not to my way of understanding. But what he does do is he goes on and he talks about the differences between taste and genius. And in this section he talks about how taste is the faculty for correctly apprehending a beautiful thing and seeing it correctly as beautiful and not merely as pleasant, not something that's merely sensorily pleasant. It has to be a kind of disinterested pleasure, as we have already seen. Whereas genius is the faculty for producing the beautiful art object. And the genius is the being whom nature has favored in order to produce, to have the talent to produce original works of art. And so for Kant, the genius is the individual who is capable of producing original works of art as exemplary models that do not conform to any previous rules. The genius makes the rules, and he might establish a school, let's say like a school of Rembrandt or a school of Leonardo, where he has these followers because the rules that he has established were so effective and so original that it has its own internal coherency and its own internal theory that generates a school of followers. So followers accrete to him, but they remain followers insofar as they imitate the master, and they will only stay followers insofar as they follow those rules and do not themselves go on to discover their own original ideas. And so the genius is the originator of original ideas. And so he also makes the comment in here that even the ugly can be represented in beautiful art. The furies, for example, nature, diseases, the devastations of war, and so forth. Those are all things that are, we might regard as ugly, but that are also represented in beautiful works of art. But the one thing that cannot be represented, according to this now outdated, of course, classical aesthetic, is disgust. Disgust is not something that can be transformed and sublimated into an aesthetic emotion that gives us pleasure. And so Odd Nedrum's painting of a man defecating in the woods would be ruled out here in this classical aesthetic. It doesn't fit that. This is a classical aesthetic for the age of David and Watteau and Thomas Gainsborough and Anga and Goya and all the painters that were alive in Kant's day, for whom this aesthetic fits very well, but it's about to collapse mid-century with the coming of the Impressionists and the collapse of the macrosphere of the age of the world picture that takes place in the period, let's say, between the Revolution of 1848 and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. There's a macrospheric collapse there that undergoes an implosion that is then reconfigured and reconstituted by the poets of the city, who make up the Impressionists of France. They're the poets of the city, of the Baudelarian aesthetic, and they reconstitute the macrosphere with a sharp rupture that breaks and introduces us to a new aesthetic, a Baudelarian aesthetic, basically, in which art becomes more and more shocking and more has a propensity to, as in the art of Manet, to deliberately try to shock traditional complacent bourgeois sensibilities. And that shock value that begins to come into art and begins to open the door for the disgusting in art is a completely different aesthetic. It's a modernist aesthetic that belongs to Gebser's integral aperspectival macrosphere, which comes into being and crystallizes between approximately 1861, let's say, with Manet's early paintings, and ends about the time of World War II in 1945, in which Paris is the center of the art world during that period. It's a completely different aesthetic. But then Kant, continuing the discussion with genius then, Kant talks about also how, just as we have the ideas of the reason and we have concepts of the understanding, it turns out that the imagination also has ideas, and he calls them aesthetical ideas. And these aesthetical ideas produced by the imagination, there is always more in them than can ever be found in concepts. The concepts, there are no concepts that are adequate to match in a direct fit the aesthetical ideas, just as conversely we saw with the ideas of the reason, there were no intuitions that can match the ideas of the reason, God, freedom, immortality, because they transcend the possibilities of all experience. But with the aesthetical ideas of art, on the other hand, the concepts don't match. There's always more contained in an image, in an aesthetic image. That's why they generate so much art criticism and so much contradictory art criticism, because there's always more going on there than any one particular interpretation or person can ever see going on. And so he says that the genius is the individual in whom the faculties of imagination and understanding are in interplay. And the understanding has to be involved because the understanding provides the concept of the work of art. The final cause, as it were, that for which a thing is produced, comes from and is rooted in the concepts of the understanding. But the formal cause, which is the aesthetic idea, which comes out of the imagination, is rooted in the imagination and the aesthetical ideas of the imagination. They're basically images, but image ideas that the work of art realizes. And so there is this harmony or accord between the imagination and the understanding in the genius. And that's more or less Kant's discussion of the genius. It's an old-fashioned discussion. We don't so much, after Joseph Beuys said that anyone and everyone can become an artist, we don't so much have this idea anymore of the great genius. But they certainly had it in Kant's day. This was the day, remember, of Napoleon and Goethe. So geniuses were in abundance in those days. They're not so much around anymore. And then he proceeds and he finishes off the chapter by dividing up the arts. He has a section where he talks about the basic arts. He says that the arts correspond to the three aspects of speech, which are to say the three aspects of speech are word, gesture, and sensation or tone. And corresponding to this, then we have the arts of speech, which correspond to word, the arts of form, which correspond to gesticulation or gesture, and the arts of tone or sensation, or the arts of sensation, which corresponds to tone. But then he says this can also be broken down into two halves, the arts of thought on the one hand and the arts of intuition on the other. So for the arts of thought, we have primarily rhetoric and poetry. Rhetoric is not so much, we don't use it too much anymore today, but the arts of poetry. And then for the arts of intuition, we have the formative arts, as well as the arts of tone. The arts of tone are music, classical music, whereas the formative arts there are two types of formative art, the arts of sensible truth and the arts of sensible illusion. And the arts of sensible truth are plastic arts, and the arts of sensible illusion are painting, or is painting, rather. With regard to the arts of sensible truth, or the plastic arts, there are two kinds there, architecture on the one hand and sculpture on the other. Sculpture represents things in nature as they are. Sculpture, at least in this classical period, sculpture represents things in nature as they are. They might be myth figures, but they're still representations of the natural world or the supernatural world. Whereas in architecture, the architecture represents a building, the building is always a realization of a supersensible idea, as Kant calls it, of something that is not found in nature. The temple, the Doric temple, the Gothic cathedral, the Baroque palace, these are all realizations of ideas not found in nature. And so that's what architecture does. Painting, we have, for painting, he actually groups landscape gardening together under painting since both have to do with representing in illusory form the organization of nature in a certain way. Painting represents it in a two-dimensional way. Landscape gardening represents the organization of nature in a three-dimensional way, but still organizes it harmoniously. And then, of course, we have the arts of tone, classical music. And he also says the art of color, but he doesn't find what this art of color is, so I'm not sure what it is. And that's basically it. This is his sort of updating of Lessing's Laocoon, in which Lessing had made the distinction between sculpture and poetry. Sculpture and painting on one hand is the arts of space, and poetry and classical music on the other is the arts of time. This is sort of Kant's response to that and his updating of it. And it's basically a collection of odds and ends that he uses to finish off his grand discussion of the arts of form. Then we come to what's up next, the second division, the dialectic of the aesthetical judgment, in which we will look at nature now as though it were a beautiful art object and deal with teleology.